It was a cold morning, the kind of morning when the world feels quiet but heavy, as if it knows the weight a man carries in his heart. He sat alone on a wooden bench in the park, hands buried deep in the pockets of his dark navy hoodie, staring at the ground as if the answers to life's biggest questions were hidden between the cracks of the pavement. His sneakers were worn out, dust covering the laces, a silent reminder of all the roads he had walked with dreams that once burned bright but now flickered. Like dying embers, people passed by him, some laughing, some rushing to work, some holding hands with people they loved. But in his chest, there was only silence, and in his mind, there was only one thought. Why does life keep knocking me down? He had tried again and again, only to be met with failure. The job interviews that ended with polite rejections, the business idea that collapsed before it even began, the relationships that slipped away no matter how much he tried to hold on. Every failure weighed on him like stones tied around his body, dragging him deeper into self-doubt. He remembered the last time he tried to explain his dreams to his family. His father looked at him with concern, his mother tried to encourage him with a smile, but his brother laughed softly, saying, "Maybe it's time to be realistic." That sentence cut deeper than any wound. Was he being unrealistic? Was he foolish to believe he could build something great out of a life that seemed destined for mediocrity? The chill in the air pressed against his skin, but the real coldness was inside him, a numbness that came from too many broken attempts. He felt small and visible, like the world had moved on without him. And yet, in that silence, he heard something faint, a memory of his own voice, younger and more alive, whispering, "Don't give up. One more try." He closed his eyes and almost saw his younger self standing in front of him, full of fire, reminding him of who he once wanted to be. A deep breath escaped his chest, heavier than the weight he carried. He looked up at the sky. The clouds were gray, but in between them, just for a moment, a ray of sunlight broke through. It was small, almost fragile, but it was there and it touched his face. Something shifted inside him. Maybe life wasn't asking him to be perfect. Maybe it was asking him to rise, even if he had fallen 100 times before. His hands gripped the edge of the bench, tightly as if anchoring himself to a decision. He thought about the boxer who doesn't stop the fight after being knocked down, about the runner who finishes the race even with bleeding feet, about the countless men and women who had turned their failures into the very fuel that built their victories. He whispered under his breath, "This isn't the end. This is where I start again." The words sounded fragile at first, but as he repeated them, they grew stronger. His eyes no longer looked at the ground, but straight ahead, as if he could see a future that was still blurry but waiting for him. He rose from the bench, brushing off the dust from his jeans, pulling his hoodie tighter around him. The first step felt heavy, but he took it anyway. The second step felt lighter. By the third, there was rhythm. He didn't have a plan yet, didn't have the resources, didn't even have certainty. But he had something more important. He had chosen not to stay down. And sometimes that single decision is enough to change everything. He walked through the park, past the trees whose leaves had begun to fall, past the children chasing a ball with laughter, past the old man feeding birds by the fountain. He felt the world again, not as an enemy, but as a place where he still belonged. For the first time in a long time, his shoulders felt less heavy. For the first time in a long time, he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small curve on his lips, but it was real. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning, because even if life pushed him down again, he would rise stronger. The city lights flickered as evening descended, and he found himself walking without direction, the sound of his footsteps echoing softly against the pavement. His hoodie kept him warm, but it couldn't shield him from the chill of uncertainty. He wondered where he was heading, yet for the first time in months, he didn't feel paralyzed by the question. Each step forward was a statement to himself. "I'm not done yet." He walked past tall buildings, shops closing for the night and people rushing home. For a moment he envied them. Their lives seemed stable, predictable, safe. But then he reminded himself, he was not chasing safety. He was chasing growth. He was chasing the man he was meant to become. His mind began to replay every failure he had endured. The exam he had once failed despite studying for nights, the friend who turned his back on him when he needed support, the opportunity he lost because fear held him back. Those memories came like waves, each threatening to drown him in regret. But this time he refused to sink. Instead, he let them remind him of something powerful. He had survived every one of those moments. They had not broken him, even if they had scarred him. He stopped near an old bookstore, its glass windows fogged from the cold. He stepped inside, drawn by the warm glow of a dim lamp. The air smelled of paper and dust, and the silence was comforting. His eyes wandered until they landed on a shelf labeled Biographies. He pulled out a book about a man who had failed dozens of times before achieving greatness. He flipped through the pages, his heart steadying with every line. These were not just stories, they were mirrors reflecting his own journey. He sat on the floor between shelves, hoodie wrapped around him, reading about how others had risen stronger after countless falls. The more he read, the more he realized that failure was not his enemy. It was his teacher. Every rejection, every heartbreak, every collapse, it had all been shaping him into someone tougher. Wiser, hungrier. Hours passed, and the bookstore grew quiet. He closed the book, his reflection caught faintly in the glass door as he prepared to leave. He didn't see a broken man anymore. He saw someone unfinished like a painting, still waiting for the final strokes. His scars weren't weaknesses. They were the proof that he had fought battles others never dared to enter. Back on the street, the city's noise surrounded him again, but it no longer overwhelmed him. He pulled his hoodie tighter and whispered to himself, "I will rise." Not just once, not just today, but every time life pushes me down. The words rang true, like a vow he couldn't afford to break. The bus stop was nearby, crowded with people. He leaned against the pole, waiting, not just for the bus, but for the next chapter of his life. A little boy nearby dropped his toy car, and instinctively he bent down, picked it up, and handed it back with a smile. The boy's face lit up, and in that simple exchange, he felt something shift inside him. Even in small moments, he still had the power to bring light to others. That realization warmed him more than the hoodie ever could. When the bus arrived, he stepped in and sat by the window. The glass was cold against his hand, but his heart burned with new determination. As the city blurred past, he thought, I don't need to have it all figured out. I just need to keep moving forward. For the first time in a long time, he believed those words. The bus rumbled into the distance, carrying not just a young man in a hoodie, but a man who had chosen to stand up and walk again. The bus ride stretched into the night, the hum of the engine a steady background to his thoughts. Each turn of the wheels felt like a reminder. He was moving forward, leaving behind the weight of yesterday. When the bus finally slowed to a stop near his neighborhood, he stepped off and was greeted by the chill of the evening air. The streets were quiet, lined with dim streetlights, their glow casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. He walked slowly, his sneakers scraping against the ground, but his mind felt alive. For the first time, he wasn't haunted by his failures. He was learning from them. He recalled the stories from the book he had read, giants of history who had stood where he was now, broken but not defeated. If they could rise, why couldn't he? As he approached the small apartment building he called home, he paused at the entrance. The faded paint, the rusted gate, the narrow staircase, it all looked the same as yesterday. But inside him, something was different. He wasn't just returning home. He was stepping into a training ground for his comeback. Inside, the room was small and cluttered. A mattress on the floor, a desk with scattered notebooks, a flickering bulb overhead. He sat at the desk, pulling out a notebook that had long been abandoned. The first pages were filled with ideas he once believed in, plans, goals, dreams scribbled in hurried handwriting. Some had been crossed out in frustration, others left unfinished. For a moment, he felt the old ache of disappointment. But instead of closing the book, he turned to a fresh page. With the same hand that once trembled with doubt, he began to write again. He wrote not about what he had lost, but about what he could still create. The words came slowly at first, then faster, flowing like water breaking through a dam. He wrote about the man he wanted to become, the discipline he needed, the habits he must build. He wrote promises to himself, each sentence a seed planted in the soil of his determination. Hours passed. the city outside falling asleep while his pen scratched relentlessly across the page. By the time dawn began to push its light through the window, his notebook was filled with plans. They weren't perfect, but they were real. And for the first time in a long time, he felt in control. Exhausted but satisfied, he leaned back in his chair. His eyes caught the faint orange glow of sunrise peeking through the curtains. He smiled, not because he had already won, but because he was finally fighting again. He knew there would be setbacks ahead, more falls waiting to test him. But now he had a vow every fall would only make him stronger. He stood, stretched his arms, and looked in the mirror hanging on the wall. The reflection staring back at him wasn't a man beaten by life. It was a man preparing for the next round. His dark hoodie, his tired eyes, his messy hair, they were all symbols of where he had been. But the fire in his gaze told a different story of where he was going. He whispered to his reflection, "This time I will not stop. This time I rise," and with that he closed the notebook, tied his sneakers, and stepped out once more into the world, not to escape his struggles, but to face them head-on. The morning air was crisp as he stepped outside, notebook tucked under his arm, the hoodie shielding him from the early chill. The city was just waking up, streets slowly filling with the noise of vendors opening shops and commuters rushing to catch buses. But he wasn't rushing anymore. For once, his steps felt deliberate, as if each one was guided by the words he had written the night before. He walked to a nearby park, the same one where he had sat on the bench in despair just days earlier. The bench was still there, silent and ordinary, but when he saw it now, he didn't see defeat. He saw the place where he had made a decision to rise. He smiled faintly as he walked past it, no longer chained to the memory of his lowest moment. The path ahead was lined with trees, their leaves glowing under the sunlight. He found a quiet spot under one of them, sat down cross-legged, and opened his notebook. He read through his promises, his plans, the goals he had written. They weren't dreams floating in his mind anymore, they were written commitments. And as he read, he felt a responsibility to honor them. He pulled out his phone and began searching for opportunities, jobs, small projects, anything that could give him a start. He sent emails, applied for internships, and even looked up volunteering work. For once, rejection didn't scare him. He had faced rejection before, but now he understood it wasn't the end. It was just another step. As the hours passed, he noticed a group of young men practicing basketball on the court nearby. Their laughter and energy filled the air. He stood and walked toward them, asking if he could join. They welcomed him with smiles, and soon he was running across the court, sneakers squeaking against the ground, hoodie damp with sweat. Every shot he missed, every stumble he made, he laughed instead of feeling embarrassed. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about showing up, about trying again, for the first time in years. He felt alive in the simplest way, through movement, through connection, through effort. His body ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that reminded him he was still here, still capable. After the game, as he sat on the sidelines catching his breath, one of the players asked him, "You play often?" He shook his head, smiling. "Not really. But I'm starting again." The words slipped out naturally, and he realized how true they were. He was starting again, not just in the game, but in life. That evening he returned home exhausted but fulfilled. He opened his notebook once more and added a new line. "Every day, I will do something that moves me forward, no matter how small." It didn't have to be a grand victory. Even a single step mattered, as long as it was forward. As night fell, he stood by his window, looking out at the glowing city. Somewhere in the distance, neon lights flickered, cars rushed by, and people carried their own struggles. He thought of them, of how many people must be fighting silent battles like his. For the first time, he felt he wasn't alone. His story wasn't unique, it was part of something greater. And maybe one day, his journey could inspire someone else the way those biographies had inspired him. He whispered into the night, "I will keep rising. I will not stop." And the city lights seemed to nod in agreement. Days turned into weeks, and weeks began to form the shape of a new life. His routine was still simple, but it was consistent. Each morning he woke before sunrise, put on his hoodie and sneakers, and stepped out into the world with purpose. Some days he went to the park to write, Some days he searched tirelessly for opportunities. And some days he simply moved his body running, exercising, playing basketball again with the strangers who had slowly become friends. He didn't transform overnight. There were mornings when the weight of doubt still tried to sit on his shoulders, when he questioned if he was strong enough to keep going. But every time those thoughts came, he looked back at where he had started, on that cold bench, head down, ready to give up. He remembered the silence of failure, the heaviness of rejection, and then compared it to the man he was becoming. That memory alone was enough to remind him he had already risen once, and he could rise again and again. One afternoon, as he sat at a small cafe with his notebook open, a young boy approached shyly, holding a basketball under his arm. "You're the guy who plays at the park, right?" the boy asked. He smiled and nodded. "Yeah, that's me." The boy hesitated, then said, "You always keep trying, even when you miss. My brother says you never give up. Can you teach me how to play?" The words hit him deeper than the boy could ever know. In that moment, he realized that his journey wasn't just about himself anymore. His resilience was visible to others. It was inspiring someone else to stand up, to try, to not give up. He agreed with a smile, and that evening he found himself teaching the boy how to dribble, how to shoot, and most importantly, how to keep trying even when he missed. That night, as he walked home, sweat on his forehead and joy in his chest, he whispered to himself, "This is what rising stronger really means. Not just for me, but for others too." Over time, small doors began to open. A volunteering opportunity led to new connections. A side project turned into paid work, and slowly but surely, the pieces of his life began to fit together. They weren't perfect pieces, but they formed a picture he could be proud of. And yet, what mattered more than the opportunities was who he had become through the process. He no longer feared failure because he understood its purpose. He no longer felt broken because he had turned his scars into strength. He no longer saw himself as invisible because he now carried within him the quiet confidence of someone who had risen from the ashes. One evening, he returned to the same park bench where it had all begun. He sat there, hoodie pulled tight, sneakers dusty from the day's efforts, and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. The world looked the same, but he knew he had changed forever. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. Life would still knock him down, of that he was certain. But he also knew, without a single doubt, that every time he fell, he would rise stronger. And with that quiet conviction, he stood up from the bench, walked forward into the fading light, and smiled because this time he was ready for whatever came next.